A wedding of thorns. The dress, a delicate cage woven from silk and lace, mocked her. Rose confronted her reflection, a stranger trapped within its immaculate embrace. This creamy confection, meant to herald purity and a fresh start, felt instead like burial cloth. The summer sky vibrancy had leached from her eyes, leaving them mirroring only the elaborate frame and the gilded confinement of her future. A finch in a gilded cage, she mused, primping for a master's eye, not her own choosing. She ran her fingertips along the embroidered vines, seed pearls gleaming like crystallized sorrow. Each meticulous stitch whispered of promises unmade, vows unspoken, a life unchosen. This spectacle was no wedding, but a stark transaction, the yielding of meadowsweet to Baron von Hesse's insatiable appetite. A marriage forged of brambles, cruel and unforgiving. A rap sounded against the heavy oak. Aunt Mathilde entered, worry creasing her face despite the forced brightness of her smile. "Rose, darling, nearly time. Are you quite ready?" Ready? How could she embrace, surrendering her very existence, her liberties, to a man she loathed? A meager nod was all she could muster, the lie lodging in her throat. Mathilde fussed with a strand of hair, smoothing out imaginary flaws. "You look exquisite, child. Truly. The Baron will be well pleased." The final word resonated with unspoken implications. Well pleased. As if Rose were livestock at market, judged on outward appearance alone. A blare of trumpets shattered the oppressive quiet. The Baron had arrived. A shiver snaked down Rose's spine, a chilling premonition of her life to come. She pictured him, the calculating chill in his gaze, the fleshy downturn of his lips, the blend of cloying cologne and stale cigar smoke that clung to him like a shroud. The music swelled, a distorted imitation of gaiety. Mathilde squeezed her hand, pleading with her eyes for a strength Rose didn't possess. "Remember your duty, Rose. To family. To your people. Duty. Always duty." But what of her own yearnings, her individual dreams? Seemingly inconsequential, when balanced against the cold calculus of land and leverage. The church bells began to toll, each clang a hammer blow against hope's fragile shell. She inhaled deeply, forcing her spine straight, projecting a semblance of calm. She would not shatter. Not yet. As she entered the corridor, lined with silent, watching faces, she glimpsed the Baron through the church doors. He stood at the altar, a dark figure etched against the colorful explosions of the stained glass, exuding arrogance and command. His bespoke suit, doubtlessly from the finest houses of Europe, couldn't conceal the predatory glimmer in his eyes as he watched her approach. A wolf draped in Seville roe, poised to devour the lamb offered forth. A smirk played on his lips, suggesting he fathomed the very depths of her despair. A gold watch chain winked, and rings adorned 3 fingers, each a testament to his dominion and wealth. Rose detested him with a raw, furious intensity, a hatred that threatened to consume her from within. The organ music intensified, a somber lament echoing through the sanctuary. Rose began her procession, each step a violation of her very being. She swept her gaze across the assembled faces, a sea of indifference and rehearsed smiles. Her father, his face ashen and etched with guilt, sat in the front pew, unable to articulate his remorse. She desperately sought some signal, a glimmer of solace, a lifeline in this ocean of despair. Her gaze snagged on a young boy, scarcely old enough to grasp the weight of the moment. He looked at her with wide, trusting eyes, a silent question lingering within their depths. In that instant, a desperate plea bloomed within her, a silent scream for escape. If only someone could see beyond the facade, the terror veiled by silk and lace. If only someone would deliver her from this thorny union. Her eyes flicked toward the church entrance, lingering there for a heartbeat before she forced herself to look away. The doors remained fast, barring any possibility of salvation. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, advancing toward her doom. Each step drew her closer to the altar, closer to the Baron, closer to a life of wretched servitude. The church seemed colder now, the air thick with the burden of unspoken dread. The shadows' intervention. The droning voice of the priest was a distant hum. The heavy scent of incense, usually comforting, now suffocated Rose. She focused on the worn floorboards beneath her satin slippers, willing herself to remain upright, a porcelain doll about to shatter. Then the world exploded, not with fire but with noise. A shattering crash from the back of the church. Gasps and screams erupted. Rose's head snapped up. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, stood a figure. Tall, lean, and cloaked in shadow. 2 revolvers gleamed in his hands. "This wedding is over," a voice, rough as gravel, cut through the chaos. It was a voice that commanded attention, a voice that promised violence. Baron von Hesse roared, his face a blotchy crimson. "Seize him! Kill him!" The Baron's guards, previously lounging with an air of bored superiority, scrambled into action. But the shadow was faster. 2 shots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. 2 guards crumpled, clutching at newly formed holes in their expensive uniforms. Rose stood frozen, a statue in white silk. This couldn't be real. This had to be a nightmare. Yet, the acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils, and the screams were undeniably genuine. The shadow moved with impossible speed, weaving between pews, his guns spitting lead. Not to kill, Rose realized, but to disarm, to disable. He moved with a focused efficiency that was terrifyingly graceful. He reached the altar in seconds. The Baron, sputtering with rage, drew a pistol of his own. But before he could level it, the shadow's boot slammed into his wrist, sending the weapon skittering across the floor. Then, the shadow was scooping Rose up into his arms. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rose didn't resist. She clung to him, the rough wool of his coat a stark contrast to the suffocating silk of her gown. His grip was firm, reassuring. "Hold on," he growled, and leaped from the altar, landing with a jarring thud that sent a fresh wave of panic through the assembled guests. He didn't run. He walked, a predator claiming his prize. The remaining guards, momentarily stunned by his audacity, hesitated. Outside, the sound of pounding hooves grew closer. A magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian, stood waiting. With a grunt, the shadow swung Rose onto the horse. He mounted behind her, his body pressed close. The scent of leather, sweat, and something wild and untamed filled her senses. "Hold tight," he said again, his voice softer this time, almost gentle. Then they were moving. The stallion surged forward, bursting through the church doors and into the blinding sunlight. Rose squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in the shadow's back as they thundered down the lane. Behind them, the sounds of shouting and pursuit grew fainter. Rose risked a glance over her shoulder. The Baron stood outside the church, his face contorted with fury, a pathetic figure in his ruined finery. Tears streamed down Rose's face, a mixture of fear, relief, and utter disbelief. She was free. Somehow, impossibly, she was free. They rode for what felt like hours, the black stallion eating up the miles. Rose clung to the shadow, her body aching, her mind reeling. Finally, as dusk began to settle, they slowed to a walk. They were deep in the woods now, the air cool and damp. The shadow dismounted, then reached up to help Rose down. Her legs were shaky, and she stumbled, falling against him. He steadied her, his hand lingering on her arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice surprisingly concerned. Rose nodded, unable to speak. She looked up at him, trying to make out his features in the fading light. All she could see was the outline of his jaw and the glint of his eyes. "Who are you?" she finally managed to whisper. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Some call me Shadow." Baron von Hesse watched them disappear, a vein throbbing in his temple. His perfectly coiffed hair was now a disheveled mess, his expensive suit covered in dust and blood. The humiliation was almost unbearable. He roared again, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. "Find them. I want them both dead. And bring her back to me, across the dusty plains. The rhythmic thud of hooves against the parched earth was the only sound for a long while. Rose clung to Shadow's back, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face. The expensive silk of her wedding dress felt strangely out of place, a stark contrast to the rough leather of Shadow's jacket beneath her hands. She swallowed, the dust already coating her throat. Why? The word was barely a whisper, lost in the vastness of the plains. She repeated it, louder this time. Why did you do that? Shadow didn't answer immediately. He remained a solid, unyielding presence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, his voice, gravelly and low, broke the silence. Does a bird ask why it flies from a cage? Rose frowned. I wasn't in a cage. Weren't you? He finally turned his head slightly, enough for her to see the glint of something unreadable in his eyes. A gilded cage is still a cage, Miss Meadowsweet. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the plains into a shimmering haze. Rose shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. Her fine wedding shoes were already pinching, and she could feel the beginnings of a blister forming on her heel. She hadn't eaten since early that morning, and her stomach gnawed with hunger. Shadow seemed to sense her discomfort. He reined the horse to a halt near a cluster of jagged rocks that offered a sliver of shade. He dismounted in one fluid motion, then reached up to help her down. His touch was surprisingly gentle, calloused fingers firm around her wrist. We'll rest here a while, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He produced a water skin and a small pouch from his saddlebags. Offering her the water skin first, he watched as she drank deeply, the cool liquid easing her parched throat. Then, he opened the pouch, revealing a handful of dried meat. It's not wedding cake, he said, a hint of something that might have been amusement in his voice, but it'll keep you going. Rose took a piece, chewing it slowly. The jerky was tough and salty, but she was grateful for it. She watched Shadow as he leaned against one of the rocks, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He seemed completely at ease in this harsh, unforgiving landscape, as if he were a part of it. Who are you? Really? She asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Everyone calls you Shadow, but what's your real name? He didn't answer, and for a moment, she thought he was going to ignore her. Then, without looking at her, he said, Jedediah. Jedediah Stone. Jedediah, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It suited him somehow, solid and strong like the rocks around them. Why did you save me, Jedediah? He finally looked at her, his gaze piercing. Because no woman should be forced to marry a man she doesn't love. Rose felt a strange flutter in her chest. Was that the truth? Or was there something more? Something he wasn't telling her? As they continued their journey, the town of Havenwood shrunk into the distance, becoming a smudge on the horizon. With each passing mile, Rose felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly. Relief at escaping the stifling expectations of her family and the looming prospect of a life with Baron von Hesse. But also fear. Fear of the unknown, of what lay ahead, and a growing sense of something else. Something she couldn't quite name, but that felt like a fragile seed of hope planted in the barren landscape of her heart. She glanced at Jedediah, his face etched with shadows from the setting sun. He was a dangerous man, she knew, a man with a reputation. But he had saved her, and for that, she would be forever in his debt. The hidden canyon, the world pitched downward, the unbroken expanse yielding to a sudden abyss. With practiced ease, Shadow guided their mounts down the precipitous trail, the air chilling as the sound of hooves against the stones echoed in the growing stillness. Rose inhaled sharply, gripping the saddle. A single misstep meant a plummet into nothingness. This was no leisurely stroll on a manicured estate. Reaching the canyon floor felt like entering a hidden realm. Sheer vermilion cliffs cradled a verdant strip nourished by a hidden spring. Cottonwoods offered a cool reprieve, while a vibrant tapestry of wildflowers splashed color across the rugged terrain. It was a haven, a secret shared only with the whispering currents of air. Welcome to my little corner of the world, Shadow announced, a ghost of amusement playing on his lips. Far from modest, a huddle of roughly constructed buildings clung to the canyon wall, plumes of smoke rising from the chimneys. The people moving about bore the same marks of hardship and resilience Rose had noticed in Shadow's features. These were not the pampered faces of Baron Metasweet's court. As they entered the cluster of dwellings, activity stilled. Eyes, guarded and sharp, turned their way. A weathered man, an empty sleeve pinned to his tunic, stepped forward. "Shadow," he greeted, his voice gravelly. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Who's the company?" His gaze lingered on Rose, laced with suspicion. "This is Rose," Shadow stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's with me." The man, whom Rose would later know as Silas, nodded slowly. "All right, Shadow. Just hoping no trouble follows you. We've got our share already." The air loosened slightly. People returned to their tasks, tending to animals, repairing equipment, patching garments. Rose felt a surprising sense of connection, a feeling utterly foreign to the constraints of her father's estate. These were survivors, individuals who understood adversity. A girl, her face dusted with grime, approached Rose. "Hungry?" she offered, her voice surprisingly soft. "I can get you some stew." Rose offered a grateful smile. "Yes, please. Thank you." The stew was simple fare, yet it was the most gratifying sustenance Rose had tasted in weeks. As she ate, she watched the inhabitants of this refuge. A lithe woman, her eyes keen, honed blades with a practiced hand. A burly man, his face crisscrossed with scars, coaxed a wistful tune from a battered harmonica. Each face held a silent narrative, a chronicle of suffering and endurance. Shadow walked his horse towards a ramshackle structure. Rose followed, curiosity piqued. He stopped at a makeshift stable, where a young Mustang lay prone, its leg bent at an impossible angle. Shadow knelt, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he assessed the injury. "Poor thing," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He produced a blade and a flask of whiskey. Rose watched, riveted, as he cleansed the wound with swift, precise movements. Then, he fashioned a splint with scavenged wood and strips of cloth. "Will it recover?" Rose asked, her voice a mere breath. Shadow glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Maybe. Depends on its grit. We'll keep it easy, give it a fighting chance." He rose, wiping his hands on his worn trousers. The severe lines of his face seemed to soften, his habitual reserve momentarily absent. Rose discerned a vulnerability she hadn't imagined, a spark of compassion that betrayed his notorious reputation. "Why do you care?" she inquired. "Why bother with a wild creature?" He shrugged, his gaze returning to the injured animal. "It's hurt, needs mending. Isn't that enough?" Rose reflected on her own existence, confined and suffocated, and wondered if anyone would have recognized her pain and offered solace without expecting repayment. Perhaps Shadow was not the villain he was painted to be. Perhaps, beneath that rugged exterior, a kernel of humanity thrived. As twilight descended upon the canyon, painting long shadows across the red rock formations, Rose felt drawn to Shadow. He was a conundrum, a man capable of violence who displayed unexpected gentleness, a feared outlaw who sheltered the vulnerable. He was an enigma, and Rose, for the first time in her life, felt an intense yearning to decipher him. A serpent in pursuit, Baron Leopold von Hesse surveyed the wreckage of his meticulously planned wedding feast. Smashed crystal glittered underfoot, mirroring the fury contorting his features. The scent of spilled wine mingled with the acrid tang of gunpowder, a vulgar assault on his refined sensibilities. He kicked a mangled floral arrangement, sending wilting lilies skittering across the marble floor. "Find her!" he roared, his voice cracking with unrestrained rage. "Find them both, and bring them back to me. Alive. I want them to suffer." His manservant, a frail man named Pfister, cowered in the doorway. "But the Shadow, Baron. He's dangerous." Von Hesse sneered, adjusting the elaborate lace at his cuff. A vein throbbed in his temple. "Dangerous? I am Baron Leopold von Hesse. Danger is what I deal. He spat on the floor, the spittle landing inches from Pfister's polished shoe. Find someone who isn't afraid of shadows. Find the serpent. Silas Serpent Blackwood sat hunched over a scarred table in the dimly lit back room of the Rusty Spur Saloon. The air hung thick with stale beer and the murmur of hushed conversations. He nursed a glass of cheap whiskey, his eyes, the color of glacial ice, scanning the room with predatory patience. He wore no frills, just practical, well-worn leather and steel. His reputation preceded him, a bounty hunter of unparalleled skill and ruthless efficiency. The door creaked open, and Pfister, looking like a rabbit caught in a snare, edged into the room. He approached Serpent cautiously, his voice a nervous tremor. "Mr. Blackwood? Baron von Hesse requests your services." Serpent's gaze flickered to Pfister, then back to his whiskey. He took a slow sip, the silence stretching, amplifying Pfister's anxiety. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rasp. "What's the bounty?" Pfister swallowed hard. "The Baron will pay, handsomely." A woman, Rose, in the shadow. A flicker of interest ignited in Serpent's cold eyes. The shadow, a worthy challenge. Describe them. Pfister detailed Rose's appearance. The fiery hair, the emerald eyes, the delicate features that masked a surprising resilience. He then spoke of the shadow, his voice laced with fear, relaying the rumors and legends surrounding the outlaw. Serpent listened, his expression unchanging. When Pfister finished, he simply nodded. "I accept." A thin smile, devoid of warmth, twisted his lips. "Tell the Baron, consider it done." The following morning, Serpent stood at the edge of the Von Hesse estate, his gaze fixed on the chaos left in the wake of Rose's escape. The ground was churned by horses' hooves, the delicate flower beds trampled into muddy oblivion. He knelt, his long, calloused fingers tracing the outline of a distinct horseshoe print. He didn't need to be told which horse belonged to the shadow. The beast was shod with custom iron shoes. He rose, his eyes following the trail as it snaked away from the estate, disappearing into the rugged terrain. The air carried the faintest scent of roses, a ghostly reminder of his quarry. He mounted his own horse, a lean, powerful animal bred for endurance, and urged it forward. He rode slowly, deliberately, his senses attuned to the slightest detail. A broken twig, a disturbed patch of earth, the faint impression of a boot heel in the dust. Each clue, a piece of the puzzle. He was a hunter, patient and relentless. He knew his prey was fleeing, but they couldn't outrun him. The desert held no secrets from the serpent. Hours later, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the landscape, he found it, a discarded ribbon, the same vibrant green as Rose's eyes, snagged on a thorny bush. He picked it up, his fingers running over the silken fabric. A whisper of a smile touched his lips. He was close, very close. The hunt had begun in earnest. Finding her purpose, the dust of the desert had settled, replaced by the grit of the canyon hideout. Rose found herself less a captive and more a guest. An unusual guest, perhaps, in a den of outlaws, but a guest nonetheless. The initial fear that had coiled tight in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a tentative curiosity, a seedling of something akin to hope. She couldn't simply sit idle. The women here, though hardened by circumstance, moved with a weariness that tugged at her heart. She observed their movements, the way they favored a leg, winced when lifting a heavy pot. Rose remembered her grandmother's remedies, the salves and poultices she'd concocted from herbs gathered in the meadow. One evening, after a particularly rough skirmish with a rival gang, a young outlaw named Billy clutched his arm, his face pale. "Just a scratch," he muttered, but Rose saw the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. "Let me see," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. She gently unwrapped the cloth, revealing a jagged gash. Others watched, skeptical. Rose ignored them, her focus solely on Billy's wound. She recognized the telltale signs of infection brewing. "Fetch me some yarrow and comfrey," she instructed another outlaw, a burly woman named Bess, who surprisingly obeyed without question. Using a clean cloth and boiled water, Rose cleansed the wound, her touch gentle but sure. She ground the herbs into a paste, the earthy scent filling the small cave they used as a common room. "This will sting," she warned Billy before applying the poultice. He flinched but held still. Over the next few days, Rose tended to Billy's wound, changing the dressing and monitoring for any signs of worsening infection. She brewed teas of willow bark for pain and encouraged him to rest. Slowly, the redness subsided, the swelling decreased, and the wound began to heal. News of Rose's healing touch spread through the camp like wildfire. Soon, she found herself tending to a variety of ailments: burns from cooking fires, cuts from knife fights, aches from long days in the saddle. She became the camp's reluctant healer, her knowledge of herbs and gentle demeanor a welcome balm in their harsh lives. She also discovered another unexpected talent: mending. The outlaws' clothes were constantly torn and tattered, held together by clumsy stitches and wishful thinking. Rose, who had learned to sew at her mother's knee, offered to help. She gathered discarded scraps of fabric, carefully patching holes and reinforcing seams. Soon, the outlaws sported surprisingly well-repaired garments, a small touch of civilization in their rough-and-tumble world. Evenings were spent around the fire, mending clothes and listening to the outlaws' stories. She learned about their pasts, their reasons for turning to a life outside the law. Some were hardened criminals, yes, but others were simply desperate, driven to extremes by poverty and injustice. She listened, offering a kind word or a sympathetic ear. She even began to cook, experimenting with the limited ingredients available. Her first attempts were met with suspicion, but soon the aroma of her stews and breads drew the outlaws in. They ate with gusto, appreciating the warmth and nourishment she provided. Her cooking brought a sense of normalcy to the hideout, a reminder of the lives they had left behind. Shadow watched her, a silent observer in the shadows. He saw the way she interacted with the others, the kindness she offered without hesitation. He witnessed her resourcefulness, her ability to make something out of nothing. He noticed the way the outlaws responded to her, their gruff exteriors softening in her presence. He saw her not as a delicate flower, plucked from her garden, but as a resilient wildflower, blooming in the harshest of environments. He hadn't expected her to adapt so quickly, to find her purpose in this unlikely place. He had rescued her, yes, but she was rescuing them in her own quiet way. One evening, he found her sitting by the fire, mending a tear in his own coat. He stood beside her, his presence silent. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. Rose looked up, surprised. "It was nothing," she replied, her cheeks flushed. "It was," he insisted. "You've brought something different to this place." Rose hesitated, then asked, "What do you call this place?" He paused. "Home," he said finally. "For now." Rose considered the word, turning it over in her mind. Home. Was it possible to find a home in a den of outlaws, with a man shrouded in secrets? She looked around at the faces illuminated by the firelight, faces that were slowly becoming familiar, faces that were beginning to look at her with something akin to affection. Perhaps, she thought, perhaps it was lessons and longing. The weight of the revolver felt foreign and heavy in Rose's hand. It was a far cry from the needle she wielded with such ease, a tool of destruction instead of creation. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, filtering through the trees as Shadow stood behind her, his large frame a comforting presence despite the grim purpose of their lesson. "Hold it steady," he instructed, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her back. He reached around her, his calloused hand covering hers, guiding her grip. A shiver traced its way down Rose's spine, a mixture of nerves and something else she couldn't quite name. Feet shoulder-width apart, slight bend in your knees. Imagine you're rooting yourself to the ground. Rose adjusted her stance, mimicking his instructions. The air was thick with the scent of pine and gunpowder. Before them, a makeshift target, an old tin can perch precariously on a gnarled tree branch, awaited its fate. "Now focus," Shadow continued, his breath warm near her ear. Squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it. Rose inhaled deeply, trying to calm the frantic beat of her heart. She sighted down the barrel, the kind of blurry silver in the distance. She squeezed. The recoil was surprisingly powerful, sending a jolt up her arm. The kin remained untouched. Again, Shadow said, his tone patient. They repeated the process several times, each shot a small explosion of sound and smoke. Rose's arm ached. Her fingers were numb, but she was determined. She wanted to learn, to prove to herself, and perhaps to Shadow, that she was more than just a fragile flower. Finally, on her sixth attempt, the kin jumped from the branch, clattering to the ground. A triumphant grin spread across Rose's face. She turned to Shadow, her eyes shining. I did it. A rare smile flickered across Shadow's lips. You did. Not bad for a beginner. He clapped her on the shoulder, a gesture that sent warmth flooding through her. You have a steady hand, Rose. That's half the battle. The following days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Rose continued her healing and mending, tending to the scrapes and bruises of the outlaws. She mended not only their clothes, but also, in some small way, their spirits. And each afternoon, Shadow would dedicate time to her shooting lessons. She progressed quickly, her natural aptitude surprising even him. She learned to handle the gun with confidence, her aim becoming increasingly accurate. It was empowering, this newfound skill, this ability to protect herself. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the outlaws would gather around the campfire. The air would be filled with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, and the sounds of laughter and tall tales. One evening, after a particularly successful target practice, Rose found herself sitting beside Shadow, the flames dancing between them. Tell me about your family, she asked, the question bubbling up unbidden. She knew so little about him, about the man who had saved her life. Shadow stared into the fire, his face etched with shadows. He was silent for a long moment, as if wrestling with a ghost. My father was a blacksmith. A good man, worked hard. My mother, she died when I was young. Rose waited patiently, sensing the pain that lay beneath his stoic exterior. I had a younger sister, Sarah. She loved to pick wildflowers. His voice was barely a whisper. She died of a fever when she was 8. Rose's heart ached for him. She reached out and gently touched his arm. I'm sorry, Shadow. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that made her want to weep. We all carry our burdens, Rose. Some are just heavier than others. He paused, then turned to her, a question in his gaze. What about you? What were your dreams before all this? Rose hesitated, her own past a tangled web of unspoken desires. I always loved to read, she confessed, her voice soft. I dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond our little village. Silly dreams, I suppose. Not silly at all, Shadow countered. Dreams are what keep us going, what keeps us fighting. As the fire crackled and popped, they shared more stories, snippets of their lives pieced together like a fragile quilt. Rose learned about Shadow's past, about the injustices he had witnessed, the reasons he had chosen this path. He, in turn, learned about her love for healing, her yearning for knowledge, her quiet strength that had been hidden for so long. That night, as Rose lay in her bedroll, the image of Shadow's face, illuminated by the firelight, lingered in her mind. His sadness had touched something deep within her, a longing to ease his pain, to share his burdens. She wondered if he felt it too, this invisible thread that seemed to be drawing them closer, weaving their destinies together in ways she couldn't yet understand. Ambush in the canyon. The first sign wasn't a shout or a gunshot, but the unnatural stillness. The usual chorus of crickets and rustling desert creatures went silent. Rose, polishing her newly cleaned rifle by the flickering light of the campfire, felt a prickle of unease on the back of her neck. Shadow, she murmured, glancing towards the cave entrance where he stood sentinel, a dark silhouette against the star-strewn sky. Before he could answer, a volley of gunfire erupted, shattering the quiet. Bullets ripped through the air, kicking up dust, and sending sparks flying from the rocks around the campfire. Rose scrambled for cover behind a large boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Ambush!" Shadow roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. He returned fire with deadly accuracy, his shots echoing through the narrow canyon. The outlaw camp sprang to life. Men and women, roused from sleep, grabbed their weapons and returned fire, their faces grim. Rose, remembering Shadow's instructions, took a deep breath and peered cautiously over the boulder. She spotted movement on the canyon rim, figures silhouetted against the night sky, firing down into the camp. Her first shot was wide, kicking up dust near one of the figures. She adjusted her aim, focusing on her breathing, just as Shadow had taught her. The second shot found its mark. The figure stumbled and fell back from the rim. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Rose, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The attackers were relentless. They pressed their advantage, using the darkness and the high ground to their advantage. Rose saw one of the younger outlaws, barely more than a boy, get hit. He cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Without thinking, Rose darted from her cover, ignoring Shadow's shouted warning. She crawled towards the injured boy, bullets whizzing past her head. Reaching him, she dragged him behind a nearby wagon, using it as a makeshift shield. "Hold tight," she said, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound. "It'll be all right." As she worked, she noticed a glint of metal in the darkness, a sniper positioned on a higher ledge, targeting Shadow. She knew she had to act fast. Ignoring the pain in her hands from the rough terrain, Rose carefully maneuvered herself into a better position. She raised her rifle, her hands shaking slightly, and focused on the sniper. He was partially obscured by shadows, but she could see the faint outline of his rifle. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked in her hands. A moment later, the sniper cried out and slumped forward, his rifle clattering against the rocks. Shadow, who had witnessed her actions, nodded grimly. "Good shot, Rose. Now get back behind cover." The gunfight raged on. The outlaws, though outnumbered, fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. Rose continued to fire, picking off attackers whenever she had a clear shot. She moved with a newfound confidence, her movements fluid and precise. As dawn approached, the attackers began to retreat, their assault faltering. Shadow, leading a counterattack, drove them back towards the canyon entrance. The remaining outlaws cheered as the last of the attackers disappeared into the darkness. Silence descended once more upon the canyon, broken only by the crackling of the dying campfire and the groans of the wounded. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Shadow returned to the camp, his face grim. He surveyed the scene, his eyes scanning for survivors. When he saw Rose tending to the injured boy, a flicker of something akin to pride crossed his features. He knelt beside her. "You did good, Rose," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "You saved that boy's life." Rose looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt and gunpowder. "He's just a boy, Shadow," she said softly. "You didn't deserve this." Shadow nodded slowly. "No one does," he said, "but some men don't care about that." He paused, then added, "That was Silas Blackwood's doing. The serpent doesn't strike without reason." Showdown in the dust. The wind howled through the narrow canyon, whipping dust devils into miniature tornadoes that danced between Shadow and the serpent. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the ground into a shimmering mirage. The air crackled with a tension so thick, Rose could taste it, metallic and sharp. Silas Blackwood, the serpent, stood like a viper coiled, his eyes glinting with cold amusement. He was a study in controlled menace, every movement precise, every word a carefully chosen weapon. "So, Stone," he drawled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Come to play hero again? How tiresome." Shadow didn't flinch. His face, etched with years of hardship and loss, remained a mask of grim determination. "It ends here, Blackwood. Your reign of terror is over." His hand hovered near the butt of his revolver, a silent promise of swift and brutal justice. Rose stood a little behind Shadow, her heart hammering against her ribs. She clutched the small derringer he'd insisted she carry, its weight a small comfort against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She knew she wasn't a gunslinger, not like Shadow, but she wouldn't stand idly by while he faced this monster. Terror. Blackwood chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. I merely provide opportunities. Those fools who can't protect themselves are simply unfortunate. He gestured dismissively with his hand, a diamond ring flashing in the sunlight. But you, Stone, you cling to this outdated notion of justice. It's almost quaint. Shadow spat on the ground. Justice is all that stands between decent folk and vultures like you. Sentimentality, Blackwood sneered. A weakness you can't afford. He shifted his weight, his eyes flicking to Rose for a fraction of a second. Such a pretty thing you've acquired. Ashamed to see her caught in the crossfire. Rose felt a surge of anger. He was trying to rattle Shadow, to distract him. She wouldn't let him. She had to do something. She remembered Shadow's lessons, the importance of observation, of using the environment to your advantage. He's right, Shadow, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I'm a weakness. I slow you down. She took a step forward, drawing Blackwood's attention. Maybe I should just leave. Save you both the trouble. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, intrigued. Now that's a sensible girl, he said, his gaze raking over her. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement. That was her chance. While Blackwood was focused on her, she scanned the ground near him. A loose rock, half buried in the dust. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. She took another step, edging closer, her eyes fixed on his. What kind of arrangement? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, feigning fear. Blackwood smirked. One that benefits us both. You see, Stone is a stubborn man, but I'm sure you possess a certain persuasiveness. With a sudden burst of speed, Rose kicked the rock. It flew up, catching Blackwood by surprise, striking his gun hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The serpent hissed in pain and surprise, his hand flinching. In that split second, Shadow moved. His revolver was drawn in a blur of motion, the shot echoing through the canyon. The bullet found its mark, piercing Blackwood's gun hand. The serpent roared in pain, dropping his weapon. Shadow advanced, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. It's over, Blackwood. Blackwood, clutching his bleeding hand, snarled, You haven't won, Stone. This isn't over. It is for you, Shadow said, his voice like ice. He disarmed Blackwood and bound his hands tightly behind his back. The fight was over. The serpent was defeated. Rose rushed to Shadow's side, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. Are you all right? She asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. You were incredible, Rose. That took courage. She managed a weak smile. I just wanted to help. Shadow looked down at Blackwood, his face hardening once more. Take him back to camp. He instructed two of the outlaws who had ridden up to witness the showdown. See that he's locked up tight. We'll decide what to do with him later. As the outlaws dragged Blackwood away, Rose leaned against Shadow, exhausted but exhilarated. The dust swirled around them, a testament to the battle that had just taken place. The showdown in the dust was over, and for now at least they had won. But Rose knew, deep down, that this was just one battle in a much larger war. A new dawn. Barely had the dust swirled to stillness after Blackwood's capture when the earth groaned anew. A subterranean growl escalated into a deafening stampede, the clamor of countless hooves and rolling artillery. A frigid premonition clenched Rose's gut. This wasn't Blackwood's rabble licking their wounds. It was an infinitely more sinister prospect. Shadow spat a curse. Von Hess. No elaboration needed. The name dripped with malice. Within moments, the canyon's edge bristled with riders, scores draped in the Baron's livery, arrogant splashes of scarlet and gold against the weathered terrain. Leading them, Von Hess, his visage a thundercloud, eyes blazing with a possessive fury that iced Rose's veins. Rose met a sweet. His voice thundered, magnified by the canyon's architecture. Return. This is your final offer. Yield, and you shall receive clemency. Resist, and I will obliterate this forsaken hole. Silence fell, thick and heavy. Rose felt the collective scrutiny bearing down. Panic threatened, but then she glimpsed the faces around her. Not the callous countenances of killers, but the resolute expressions of those who had discovered something worth defending. Sarah gripped her shotgun, her focus unwavering. Silas, age etched deep in his features, offered a grim smile, a rifle across his lap. A community, forged in the kiln of shared suffering and nascent hope. Shadow strode forward, interposing himself between Rose and the Baron's venomous stare. His voice, though quieter than Von Hess's bellow, carried the weight of command. "This is not your jurisdiction, Baron. Retreat now, and spare yourself further disgrace." Von Hess's laugh was a dry, rasping sound. "Disgrace? You presume to speak of disgrace, Stone? You pilfered what belonged to me. You will atone for this audacity." A sweeping gesture directed toward the canyon floor. "Exterminate them. Leave no breath remaining." A crimson and steel tide cascaded down. They met a defiant bulwark. Outlaws, once a motley assortment of strays and rejects, stood unified, their makeshift defenses bolstered by scavenged metal and unwavering grit. Adrenaline surged, eclipsing Rose's fear. She seized the rifle Shadow had taught her to wield, the cool metal a grounding comfort. No gunslinger, but she would not break. She wouldn't allow these people, who had welcomed her without reservation, to be annihilated. For freedom, the cry burst from her, surprisingly robust, and she fired the opening shot. Bedlam erupted. Gunfire ricocheted off the rock faces, the air saturated with gunpowder and cries of agony. The Baron's numerical advantage was negated by the canyon's claustrophobic confines. The outlaws, intimately familiar with the terrain, exploited it to their advantage, firing from concealed positions, harassing exposed flanks. Shadow became a phantom, a whirlwind of motion and lethal precision. Man after man fell, his revolver a spitting serpent, his movements efficient and brutal. He was not alone. Sarah, with surprising marksmanship, felled riders from the heights. Silas, defying his years, proved a deadly sniper, his rifle punctuating the chaos. Rose, consumed by the fever pitch of combat, found focus. She remembered Shadow's lessons, regulating her breath, aiming steadily, squeezing. A Baron's man charged, a cruel leer plastered on his face. She aimed, fired, and watched him crumple. The battle raged, an eternity compressed into moments. The sun hammered down, turning the canyon into a furnace. But the outlaws held, their resolve fueled by desperation and a burning hunger for liberty. Imperceptibly, the balance shifted. The Baron's contingent, disheartened by fierce resistance and mounting losses, began to waver. They anticipated a perfunctory victory, a swift and merciless subjugation. Instead, they were mired in a blood-soaked stalemate. Sensing the change, Shadow unleashed a primal roar. "Now, drive them back." A groundswell of righteous fury propelled the outlaws forward. They crashed into the Baron's lines, their courage inflamed by the scent of triumph. The Baron's forces shattered. They routed, scrambling back up the canyon, abandoning their dead and dying. Von Hess watched his army implode, disbelief twisting his features. He lunged forward, aiming for Shadow, but Rose stepped in, leveling her rifle. He glared, venom lacing his gaze. You will rue this, Rose." "No, Baron," she returned, her voice unwavering. "I regret nothing." Shadow's hand found her shoulder, a reassuring touch. He turned to Von Hess, his eyes glacial. "Leave, Baron, and never return. This land is now beyond your reach." Von Hess hesitated, pride wrestling with self-preservation. Finally, with a snarl, he wheeled his horse and bolted, his tattered remnant trailing. Silence descended once more, broken only by the ragged gasps of the survivors. They had prevailed. Against impossible odds, they had defended their sanctuary. As the sun dipped, painting long shadows across the canyon floor, Rose surveyed the faces of her adopted family. Battered, bruised, but their eyes blazed with indomitable pride. They had stared into the abyss together and emerged unbroken. Shadow turned to her, his gaze softer than she had ever witnessed. "What now, Rose?" She gazed at him, at the weather lines around his eyes, at the raw strength and veiled tenderness beneath his gruff exterior. She looked at the canyon, at the stark majesty of a land, at the faces of those who had become her tribe. "We stay," she declared, conviction ringing in her tone. "We build a life here. We shelter the vulnerable. We make this a refuge for the lost and dispossessed." A hint of a smile played on Shadow's lips. "We?" Rose met his gaze, her heart overflowing with an unfamiliar warmth. "Yes, Shadow, we." And as stars began to prick the twilight canvas, they stood united, ready to confront whatever fate had in store, knowing that they had unearthed something invaluable in this desolate place. A home, a purpose, and perhaps something far deeper.